become very integral to the national mentorship movement community. So Carol, over to you. Do you want me to put up the slide share?
Yes, please. So being part of this development and this being the very first event we're doing, I want to set a little bit of context. So as the invitation went, we are now going to do a series. Roz has been the key mover and shaker in it. And it is designed to bring experienced people and newbies and everybody in between together to have an introduction and a baseline foundation. I've been involved in the Society for Organizational Learning since 1997 when I was a doctoral student and joined as a research member. There are other people on the SoL team who have joined in varying perspectives, either as practitioners from organizations or as consultants, as capacity builders. So I'm going back in this presentation to set the stage that we all have the same foundation and talk about the 5 disciplines that Peter Senge put together. And he's very clear that none of this is new. There's a big foundation of work in each of the disciplines, but he combined them with the 5th, and it's become a concept, a method, a theory, and a way of being over the years that has had a big, big impact on the world. So this is the beginning, the 5 disciplines of the learning organization. And I'd like this to be interactive. My intention is to go through slides so that you all have the same basic information. Some of the SoL people might interrupt me, which isn't an interruption, but will add to what I have to say. And then the majority of the 67 minutes will be your traditional conversation about questions, comments, and ideally examples, so that we can get some practical grounding, not just the theoretical base. Anybody have any questions, comments before I begin? Make sense? Okay. Next slide.
Sorry, Zev, I have to plug this in and I don't know where my plug is.
Okay, so this is something that has become part and parcel of how we in SoL projects present purposes, and my gratitude to Heidi who brought it into the fold. I wrote a purpose statement. It's for this session. I'm going to provide an overview of the 5 disciplines of organizational learning, and I emphasize overview. I want to do it in a way that coordinates the sharing of our insights between those who are well-versed, meaning experienced, has been around a long time in the disciplines, and those who are new. And I want it to be interactive so that there's co-learning. And the purpose so that each of you and us leaves with an understanding of the 5 disciplines central to organizational learning, but in the context of real-time relevant issues. This isn't a class that, you know, we expect you to memorize them and come back and know it intellectually. The best thing would be is you get one big insight that you can use in your daily life. That would be my success factor. Make sense? Okay, next slide. have you seen the SoL work as creating a learning organization? Is that a familiar term to you? Learning organization? I see a lot of heads nodding. That was Sangye's big contribution, that there has been a long history of work around organizational learning, and it's really a theory and a process, and it has been adapted in, I guess, since the 80s in the world of knowledge and knowledge capital. And the goal was to find a way to integrate learning processes into whatever the business or organizational outcome was, so that you took advantage of people's experience and continuously learned. So that's the definition, and there are many, many, many sites and places you can go. They're all different adaptations of it. But the fundamental element of this is to create a learning culture. And if we think about how most of the business models worked, it was to create performance culture. We looked at outcomes. So this was a very different view of how you lead, how you manage, and how you live in an organization. Peter Sangye's contribution was to add methods and tools and use the language learning organization. And there is a sense that it can be a noun, and an organization can become a learning organization. And I prefer to look at it as a verb, because in any true learning culture, you never become a learning organization. There's no end point. It's a process-based thing. So it's where people continually expand, and expansion is important. It's ongoing. Their capacity to create results, so there's a purpose in it, that they really want, truly desire, and establish new and expansive patterns of thinking. And I would say in 2021, we're beginning to really emphasize and feeling, thinking and feeling, doing and being, and where they're nurtured based on collective aspiration. So here's the really important part. It goes from individual to collective. And we set it free so that we value everybody's contribution, so that people continually learn how to learn together. So I'm going to be quiet and let you read this and see if it sinks in. Okay. Next slide. So this is how it's really broken down. As I said, it's both individual and collective. And the 5 disciplines are personal mastery, which is really how an individual is aware of themselves. And since SoL and my business experience and organizational experience began, the focus on personal mastery and use of self, particularly now, has expanded exponentially. When we first got involved in this, it wasn't as important. There were a lot of leadership courses that helped people to understand themselves as a piece of how they led. So personal mastery is a really significant foundation. And secondly, at an individual level, there's mental models or mental modeling, which is where you look at what your preconceived notions based on where you're coming from, your culture, your experience, your heritage, your personality traits, your skills, and they are really represented in sometimes very unconscious beliefs, values, mindsets, and assumptions that influence the way you think, act, and I again add feel. And the mental models have been visually put forth very often in an iceberg model. So what you see on the top of the iceberg is the behavior, and underneath it are all these things of beliefs, values, mindsets. And mental modeling as a tool allows you to understand your own and then integrate that with the collective and the group. Thank you.
You're welcome.
My morning coffee. So those are the first and the second discipline. The third and fourth are at the group level, collective, shared visioning. What do we want to create together? And the specific methodology here and tool is getting the whole system in the room. And there's been a whole field built since the publishing of the 5 disciplines in 1990 that we call collaborative technology, we call collaborative change methods. We're in the middle of doing one of those right now. If we had a common outcome we wanted to get to, we would start by saying, what do we all want? And that would be a shared vision. There are lots of tools and processes to get there. But without a collective shared vision, it's unlikely that you're going to produce a result that everybody will buy into. The fourth discipline is team learning, and it's tools to get people to think and be together, because the unit of analysis or the unit of real work is at the team level. So this was a big innovation, that in order to do something on a group level, you have to be very skilled at working in teams to do things together based on individual skills, etc. So you can begin to see the flow of personal mastery and mental modeling based on a shared vision. Then the team activates to get the result that will get you to the shared vision. And how do you do this? Through the fifth discipline, which existed, and there was already a field that modeled this called group dynamics, but systems thinking was the glue that put the other 4 together. And that's what Sangye's big contribution was. And it's really a framework that then has tools within it where you can visualize the interrelationships between people, projects, variables that allow you to really unpack and understand the underlying factors that are contributing to complex situations. And that leads to better interactions and allows you to really unpack and work with cause and effect. And there's a whole body of tools in that. And there goes Heidi.
Yeah, Carol, you asked me to interrupt with I just want to say to everybody on this call that this call is a living example of the desire for collective learning at a global level for us, for the people on here from SoL. We have a deep hunger to be able to learn in contexts where people have different ways of looking at the world. And as we probably all have seen, the mental models that we have been holding in the world are quite are quite open and fluid compared to where they were back when all of this was thought up by somebody in the West, right? We've learned in the last 40 years or the last 20 years so much more about the limits of how we see. And we haven't even begun to be able to use them to make the world a better place. So, there's lots of huge problems that have come from our inability to understand the way we each and all see. So for us, this gathering together is an opportunity for us to be experts in equal measure and beginners in equal measure, and that we believe that the collective commitment to doing that together is what will allow us greater and greater capacity to learn, because we did this together, not because we did it apart, or intellectually. So we just want you to know that we are thrilled to be doing this in this way, as a way to learn how to have greater and greater collective access to one another's true aspirations for our world.
Thank you, Heidi. I want to add to that, because Heidi has given us the entree into the historical perspective of this. When this began, the focus was on business organizations. And if you look at the original literature, all the examples were in large organizations, mostly for profit. What has happened over the years is this has moved into having big impact at all level of organization, particularly nonprofit and international, multi-sector, multi-company collaborations and networks of networks. So the impact of these underlying principles has broadened over the years enormously. So I want to go to the next slide. Well, wait a minute. Before we do that, does anybody have any comments or questions? This has been a lot of information in a short time. Luca.
I just noticed a few months ago that mental modeling is the one discipline that is destructuring, while all other are structuring our thoughts. And if we can approach it to the theory U, if anyone knows it, this is the stop, wait, look at yourself. This is a sort of first pace for entering the 5 disciplines, while the other are to build up something inside you, inside your organization.
That's a really good point, Luca, because in the text, it talks about one of the most important things is unlearning. Anissa, your hand is raised.
Hi, Carol, and everybody on the
Hi.
call. I have perhaps a question more than a comment. Under the integrating discipline, is that seen as, having to have the cognitive ability to be able to look at the, say, underlying complexity of a situation? Or can that actually be built through using the framework as a skill?
Both.
Thank you.
And my reaction to that is that's a very deep comment, not a question. And it's very definitely a both end. There's a skill set for people who model this and a whole field of systems dynamics that is very complex in and of itself and very specialized. And I believe in the right circumstance with the right people in the room that anybody can become a systems thinker. And that's actually the underlying myth that has always been in the field, that this is highly specialized and you need somebody who can do causal loop diagrams. And if that's a new term to you, I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But it looks like spaghetti on the wall, and that's very intimidating. And that's not the point of systems thinking. And the truth is, we're natural systems thinkers or integrators just because we breathe. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to go back a little in the next slide. So this was fundamental to the whole field when the concept of what's really at the core of any change effort. And there's always a tension, but it's a creative tension when you're in this organizational learning mode. And so we sometimes call it current reality or ground truth. Ground truth comes from the military perspective. But what is really here? And believe it or not, I'm very humble about realizing that in all the work I've done, very often I'm making some assumptions that I don't really unpack what is really the ground truth. And it can take time, especially when you're doing it in groups. And then, assuming you know what really is, then where do you want to go? And we name that a vision or an aspiration. And if we were in a face-to-face group and they still sold them, I would have a rubber band that would be this thick. Is rubber band a common term in South Africa? Okay. And we'd stretch it this long, right? And we'd say, if I wanted to go from current reality to vision, how would I do it? And there are only two choices. I can either move from current reality up, which is what most projects do. We make a project plan and we keep going. Or I can lower the vision. And how many times do we do that so that we can say we're accomplishing something? So I leave you with that thought, and that's a base for me of all this work. So the next slide is going back into the integration of the disciplines. And I have thanks to Heidi, and her thanks are to Charlie Kiefer, who was a co-founder of the capacity building piece of the Society for Organizational Learning work. And he put together the 5 disciplines in this framework that makes it visually extremely clear. So going back to the 5 disciplines, on the left side is personal mastery and mental modeling, which were at the individual level. On the right side is collective. So that was shared visioning and team learning. And they all intersect, and they don't necessarily have to go in a specific order. In fact, I believe they're pretty much a spiral. They keep going to get higher and higher or deeper and deeper. And systems thinking is what brings it together. And go back to what I said about current reality and aspiration or vision. The purpose is to go from the ground truth to the aspiration using these methods and tools. So this chart gives you the theory, the methods, in terms of dividing them into categories, and everything after that is individual tools, and that toolbox is expanding continuously. So this is a lot to take in. Again, I ask, are there comments or questions?
Annika has a hand up, Carol.
Ah, thank you.
I'm going to unmute. I'm coming back to mental models. It just came to my mind when you were talking about that I have in my own practice in a for-profit company, have good use of an image. I tried to explain to you how mental models really work. I am drawing a little boat on a big ocean, and this boat is anchored down at the bottom of the sea. And then if you think of that anchor as your mental model, and if you try to do change work and you do not move that anchor, whatever you do will bring the boat back to where it started. Can you see that image in front of you? And that has helped people to understand the importance of work with mental models in order to make it at all possible to have change happen. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Herman?
Yeah, Carol, thank you very much. Quite interesting. I have a question. Luca mentioned or touched very briefly on theory U. And my question to you is, you mentioned that the original focus was on business organization with Peter Senger's the fifth discipline. And it has evolved and is now being used in many different areas. Now, I see Peter Senger's work very much a precursor to what Otto Scharmer eventually did. And as far as I understand, Peter was actually a mentor for Otto for many years and enabled him to develop theory U. So where do you see the difference in application between the five disciplines and theory U? And am I totally off track when I say in many ways theory U is an advance an advancement of the concept of SoL?
So yes, yes, yes. Otto came to MIT to study with Peter and organizational learning. Peter and Otto are very integrated to this day. They are not separate. And so that's the yes. They build on, theory U builds on the five disciplines. You probably couldn't start understanding theory U without the five disciplines. My concern about going deeper into this question is, does everybody know what theory U is? And
I think, Carol, we can leave that conversation and maybe dedicate some time to theory U.
that's what I was going to suggest.
Run out of time.
But the high level answer, Herman, to your question is that theory U has become a movement and has lots of application in it. And so there are more tools and it's more advanced right now. and the fundamentals are totally integrated. Heidi, you want to say more about that? Just to get us to the point where we've answered the question, and then I think we should have a separate session on peer review.
Yeah, to Roz's point, it would be great to have another session because there are many things that came out of this codification of organizational learning. There are many other disciplines. Theory U is one of them. And we're very fortunate in that we have people that will be on this call, including people like Luca and others who have deep experience in both and can tell, and they do not, they think they're complementary, not, you know, they're deeply complementary. And it would be wonderful on this session to have people who have done both to explain what they get from each and how they fit. And it's a whole other topic that we will, I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah.
I think the word discipline is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think organizational learning is a discipline. Theory U is an application.
Mm-hmm.
So Carol, I see Dale and
yeah, I had a little question. When I look at these spontaneous, I think, okay, let's see, this one and that one and that one, I'm pretty strong, but the other two, the collective things, I'm weak and I'm looking for. Is that a type of way that you look at these 5 disciplines? Is that how you work them as a tool? This is my question.
Good question. You might, as an individual. I think as an organization, you work them simultaneously and you build the individual part in the group and you build the collective part as a group. You can't build shared visioning and team learning as an individual. You can participate in experiences that grow those skills.
Dale, what about you?
Please unmute.
My apologies, my phone rang just as you said that, Rosalind. I'm thinking, when I approach this from the perspective of the executive who's interested in building a high performance team, how do I then interact or how do I then engage with this model? Do I start in a particular place? And you kind of started on answering my question, Carol, when you talked about building individual, building in the group, and collective, building as a group. But talk to me a bit from the practical perspective of the executive who's really interested in building a high performance team. Where does he start? Or she?
What a great question. And it's at the heart of what so much of the work has been. So I'm assuming you're posing the question from the perspective of a consultant who's working with this leader, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
So you have to have an honest conversation and understand their current reality and where they want to go. There's no cookie cutter to where do you start. You start with the conversation. And then you have to be skillful enough, and this is really a skill, to understand where to enter the system to have the most impact to prove that the process works.
Right.
And sometimes, painfully, the beginning is personal understanding of the value of the collective for the leader. Because historically, it's gotten much better over the years I've been involved in this. But historically, the leader was a positional leader and they led from authority. And I'll give you the example that had the most impact on me. I was working with a group of British Petroleum people who were deeply involved in this. So there was knowledge about the overall thing. And they wanted to improve performance in refinery turnarounds. And these things happened every 5 years. So the people who were involved in it were rarely the same people.
Mhm.
And so they did an organizational learning method and process, and they had the whole group in the room. And they identified a particular problem. And there was a boiler man who was in that. No hierarchy in this. They included everybody. And they posed the problem, and the boiler man told them the answer. And one of the supervisors said, "How do you know that answer?" He says, "Because I've been doing it for 20 years of turnarounds." And then the supervisor said, "So why didn't you tell me?" And he said, "You never asked." And that to me is the starting point. Ask. The art of asking good questions is not specific on these slides, but to me, that's the most difficult and starting point skill for all of this work about learning. Heidi, you've done this a million times with leaders. Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I appreciated the relationship between Dale's question and I think it was Hans that asked the question before about how do I use this framework sort of to know where to get started? And can I look and see I don't know anything about that, so I probably I'm not even looking at that as something to consider in what I'm going to do. And Dale's talking about it the leader represents the possibility of the collective. That's why their mental models are so important. They have to understand the unintended consequences of a system that learns. And often they find out what they don't know, and it's done publicly. So one of the things you have to be really clear with in both cases is that individual or is that leader of an organization ready to have the kinds of things revealed that these practices will bring you to. And if they are, and usually that going back to the creative tension, if they can be honest about the fact that their organization, their collective, or Hans's example as an individual, is not achieving what's possible, and that there's something better, there's a world that's better. If they are really aware of that and willing to commit to that, that creative tension will reveal to them the systems that need to be in place step by step to get to the aspiration. That the willing to look honestly at the capacity of that individual or that organization to actually take those steps will begin to sensitize you to what's needed now. And it's also why it's a collective pursuit, because, for example, on these calls, we can bring up real situations and we can put our hearts and our minds together and come up with what discipline right now would be useful there, right? And sensitize all of ourselves to what that is. So it really does have to do with what do you really want, and how willing are you to give up what you have now to get something better. That really is what prepares somebody to have a learning organization. And we'll discover that together as we go through real doing and real examples and things like that.
The other part of this, Dale, is the whole climate of leadership is ready for this conversation in a way it wasn't 30 years ago. Yeah. 30 years ago, the autocratic, charismatic leader was the goal. And the book that is being read in many MBA classes and is looked at as groundbreaking is Shine's Humble series. And he talks about humility. And this is a man who was at the center of SoL when it began, and actually hasn't changed who he is, but he's now bold enough and feels the climate is right for him to emphasize this. And I think that's really the entry point for the kind of work we're doing. The culture is much more ready for it than it was when Peter did this groundbreaking work. Thank you.
Carol, I see Kate has her hand up.
Kate.
Hi. What struck me was the thought, or what Heidi said about the fact that it's changed over the last 30 years. And it strikes me that if you look at the work of Gary Hamel, it coincides with the idea of the knowledge worker. The fact that you employ people for their brains and not for their muscle anymore.
You're 100% right, and I resonate. That's why I gave you the quote about organizational learning at the beginning, because the whole field of knowledge management came out of this, where you were moving from the brawn to the brains. And if you lost a person in an organization, they weren't replaceable by somebody else who had the same physical abilities. And this all arose from the need to capture learning as people left organizations and retired. So the whole issue of knowledge and learning is integrated. And I can spend hours on that one with you if you want, Kate. That's been my field forever. So thank you for raising it as a significant issue. So if you go to the next slide, which is basically the last one, is nobody has explicitly asked, but in any conversation I've ever had in trying to get people to buy into this, the question is, so why would I do this? How do I know that I've been successful? So the measures of success, there are metrics. There are people who have demonstrated that by implementing the tools, you do improve performance. But you can ask the question or tell somebody that if you implement this as a whole framework, you will increase the quality of commitment at the individual and shared levels. How much is that worth? That's a big question, but there's no doubt that that happens. The quality of thinking individually and collectively increases. And the quality of teamwork and human interaction increases. And if you had 10 people in this room who have actually been involved in these kind of projects, processes, initiatives, they will say that it greatly improves the culture because people really want to come to work or the organization. You don't lose people because they're not recognized or appreciated. And that leads to measurable outcomes. What is happening in the companies that are on the list of most valued companies to work at? Most of them recognize the individual and create a culture where the individual and collective come together. And I would say that we could use the word learning. They are probably learning and continuous improvement groups. So the floor is yours. Where would you like to go?
Carol, one remark with regards to the measurement. I think a lot of companies are also ready today, not only to express success in form of money, like return on investment, which was the conventional kind of yardstick to measure success. But I think we look beyond that today in many organizations, at least.
That's the goal, and that's where the SDGs have been very effective. It's happening, but it's slow.
Carol, I see Viwe has a hand up.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you so much for the presentation, Carol. So from the slides, I've seen and learned that systems thinking is what what will ensure that you are able to link your vision, or maybe bridge the gap between your vision as well as your current reality. But now I'm seeing on this one around the quality of thinking, both individually and collectively. Would you say that, I'm trying to phrase my question correctly, would you say that this depends more on the individual team members' cognitive ability, or is it something that a leader can maybe inspire within a team, maybe for the team members to think at a particular level? Which of the two would you say weighs more than the other?
Both, and I think the most significant understanding, we've talked about this before, is we have a tendency to want an either or answer. And this whole world is dealing with ambiguity and complexity, and you can't have an either or answer. If you took cognitive ability alone, you wouldn't be successful. That's what's happened in many organizations that bring brilliant minds together, but without having some kind of way of integrating them collectively and taking advantage of other attributes and skills, like ability to communicate, like ability to see different perspectives. So all the disciplines are integrally involved with each other. And a leader might emphasize one or the other at a particular time in order to get to where they want to go to. And that's where the art of this is. It's an art, it's not a science. And what you're asking is, and you're not alone, it's the conundrum of our times. We come from such a scientific, cognitive history that we want that answer. And the reality is, nobody's going to give it to you. You have to be in the muck. Sorry.
Carol, Dave here. I was always puzzled by the term learning organization. It seems such a passive, reflective, non-active term for, if all of this works, for really an effective, well-directed, action-oriented, achieving, performing organization. And learning, almost to me, it switched me off the concept, because it seemed stuck in knowledge management and all that boring. When I was responsible for those sort of areas, it just didn't do it for me. When I see the model now and see what it's attempting to achieve, I obviously missed something. And maybe it's just a semantic issue. But it did seem to me not anything like strongly enough positioning what this could be in terms of generating change and action and progress.
So Dave, you're music to my ears. I'm going to quote you. That's where I entered this. And that's why, because I came from where you came from, a corporate, very siloed background in IT. That's why I began this in a fairly untraditional way, by questioning the verb versus noun offering of organizational learning, which is a verb, which I believe is what your insight is. A well-run company organization is always learning, and organizational learning is not a new concept. The innovation was to package it as a noun. And Peter himself would say that's not what he meant to do. He deeply believes what you're saying, but the popularity of it was that it could be packaged. And that was the brilliant contribution to the world. Oh, Daisy says learning organism. Now that opens an enormous door, because if you put everything I said in a big bubble and say the next frontier is to see it as a living system, which very much was in the SoL operating mode as it continued. And I would say Annika, Luca, Heidi, Roz, who are closer to the global SoL organization now, isn't living systems central to the conversation? Oh, Heidi has to leave us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'll put Annika, Luca, or Roz on the spot. Isn't living systems really where we need to go as the metaphor? Daisy is 100% right.
Yes, we are trying to unbuild the organization to have just a living being, to reduce the structure, to have more people involved at the same level. That makes more helpful to move ideas and experiences.
Yeah. Annika, over to you. I'll just very quickly say that it's really a shifting a mental model from organizations as machines that can be managed to organizations as living organisms. And Annika's nodding her head, so I'm going to hand over to her to
well, I would very shortly say that actually organizations are living systems, so are living organisms. So we just have to accept that and act accordingly. So if we don't admit that, we got lost. And I think that's the key, to understand that actually organizations are living systems.
But that is a very new a relatively new mental model that I believe was inherent in a lot of the SoL work, but you couldn't lead with that because people would say those are touchy-feely people.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm talking from current reality right now and what we know.
Correct.
Now.
Yeah. Anna, what about you? You have a hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to say that what just happened, like the conversation, organization into organism and restructuring, kind of brings me to then say that the next step is, of course, breaking down the hierarchy of the organization. And that then puts in question the whole point of leadership, where leadership is a personal quality rather than a position from which people lead. So it's kind of like, and I know I'm not a specialist in organizational learning, actually. I come into this space from a different angle. But then to me, it's really kind of a little bit an oxymoron, because most of you, I assume, do work with positional leaders in organization. And in fact, if you are promoting this kind of view, then what needs to happen is that giving up the power and more equal distribution and empowering others. So just like to hear your comments on this.
Yes.
Can I build on that, Carol?
Of course, Camilla. So
Hi.
good to see you. Camilla is another one of the SoL pioneers.
Perhaps younger than some others, but passionate for sure. I've heard the word hierarchy a lot. I think more than hierarchy, what I think is really important is the mental model that our society and our organizations are so much focused on is about control. It's about controlling what you do and controlling the outcome. And I think when you connect to a systems thinking, then it's about understanding that organizations are more complex than that, and it's about letting go of that necessity of control, whether there's a hierarchy or not. I think that's a very important thing. And yes, definitely living organisms. I mean, I wasn't there, but I do know that in the early times of SoL, you know, people like Umberto Maturana participated and exchanged and contributed a lot. And this is a biologist. And he wasn't the only one to really, you know, come forward and share his work and his way of seeing things. And the word autopoiesis is a word that generally is a bit more heard of within the SoL family. So what is I think is great is that these concepts that were perhaps quite new back then, today are more and more understood. In the text, I've seen the word's regenerations, regenerative systems, even regenerative economies is trending now, which is sort of an how do you call it, an expression of living systems. The thing that I wanted to say also a bit earlier is there's an element that comes in that perhaps isn't mentioned explicitly, but when you go through the process and you embrace the 5 disciplines, there's one element that that becomes important or becomes perhaps a natural and evident is the aspect of time. Some things require time, like a regenerative system requires time, like nature to grow requires time. And sometimes it's important to give that time. And in that, you know, obsessed about control mental model, perhaps we don't give time to things. And I think that to be able to embrace that also when someone was asking, you know, where do you start and how do you go, and Heidi was also sharing her experience. I think the aspect of time is important also to value and to nourish that. Who wants to jump in on that? I'm complete.
Thank you, Camilla.
Is what Otto Scharmer says is a holding space that you can hold for the people to approach, having no hurry. Don't push it, people inside, because you obtain nothing at all. Wait and keep the space open.
Dale, you wanted to say something.
Dale, you're on mute.
Sorry, kept on clicking it. All right. 2 things are coming to me, and hope my brain hasn't got scrambled. One is the inherent, yes, the environment is more ready now. However, not everybody in the environment is at the same stage of readiness. And in fact, some of the clients we may work with, some of the individual leaders that we may work with, may themselves be finding a conflict between what they are believing and what their uplines and boards are believing in relation to what it makes good sense to do, and where our cultures are ready for things, for approaches now that perhaps these people who, when they were learning, had learned that it wasn't ready, that it wasn't ready for. So I have that question. And then a side question is, where does trust come in then? Concepts of trust and psychological safety, where do they come into the whole picture?
Both those topics could be whole sessions. And that's where the conversation in leadership, organizational development, organizational change, human resources, every field that involves both people and process are struggling with that. It's the sweet spot with the biggest unknowns. So having a dialogue on that very question, both of those questions are actually could be sessions in and of themselves.
Can I just come in on the concept of an organism and the biological view, and even the word culture that you used, Dale? Because I've often likened an organization to an amoeba, talk about the amoeba model. And an amoeba doesn't have a hierarchy. It has senses and communications. It finds the food, it avoids the poison purely by an interconnectedness and a shared vision of survival by a bunch of cells without a central brain necessarily determining anything. And any organization which lacks the tentacles and the senses feeding things through to one another is then never capable of navigating through this environment. In the old issue of strategy and vision, I think flexibility and adaptability is far more important in today's world. Networking, collaboration, partnering, communication is really where a modern organization would succeed. So what you've described is an organization that can enable that. But as I've simplified that, saying it's an amoeba model, and is one which really is determined by a complete interconnectedness with a shared vision, but with activities almost on a decentralized basis. Just an observation. Oh, thanks, Carol.
We should quote that. That would have, if we would have started there, the talk would have been very short.
Thank you, Carol. That's the second time you want to quote me. I'm very flattered. Herman has a question or a comment.
Yeah, what I like about, should I say, philosophies like SoL, theory U, etc., that they compel us to look at things and situations with fresh eyes. It often reminds me about a quote that is credited to Marcel Proust, who said, "The true voyage of discovery is not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And I think that is surely one of the objectives of an organization like SoL.
So I would just like to pause the conversation for a moment, seeing as we are heading up to 67 minutes. And I know for those of you who were not on the call, we chose to mark the moment of 67 minutes in honor of Nelson Mandela's struggle for social and political freedom, and a tradition we hold here in South Africa in honor of his life and celebrating the 18th of July. And so I just want to thank everybody for having spent 67 minutes in community and hopefully in tribute to a very great man. And just to say that at National Mentorship Movement, we really took a look at the 67 minutes, and Cabello, who's not on the call, proposed that perhaps we should ask people to celebrate every single month by dedicating 67 minutes to mentorship. So if anybody knows anybody who would like to really contribute greatly in the South African environment and to helping people in our country who need support, we would so appreciate a contribution of 67 minutes or the contribution of people you know who might be willing to contribute. So thank you, everybody. And we are, as I said, going to hold this call going. And over to you, Bongani, you have your hand up.
Thank you so much. My question touches on what Dave has partially touched on, but my question to Carol, in your example of the rubber band, there's something that raised a bit of alarm bells as the old way of thinking in terms of vision. When you said when we usually move projects up, instead we should be moving the vision down. My question,
No.
and it's not what it.
I didn't say we should move the vision down. I said we can as an alternative. No, we never want to move the vision down.
That's why I'm
the vision.
That's why I'm sitting here panicking and I'm thinking, did I misunderstand? Because now I thought the vision, I don't compromise on my vision. So if now I have to lower the vision, thank you, you've clarified it.
Not that.
Yes.
I'm so glad you asked that question. I don't want you to leave with that misconception, or anybody else if I confused you.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you for asking.
So are there any other questions or comments? Dave, you're pretty good at reading the chat box, which I haven't even noticed. So if anybody's put something in the chat that you'd like to bring into the room, please do so, because I'm going to also close the call in a few minutes, having kind of put a damper on the whole thing. Yes.
There is a very significant question or statement from Hans in the chat, which I really wanted to make sure became on the table. He said, or Hans, would you like to say it? Would you say it?
Yeah, I could. I mean, I'm involved in developing regions, and then we're not talking about one organization. We're talking about many different organizations that don't naturally work together. So it's quite a tender thing to get those partners together. And often the key problem is that in the area where I work, food systems is usually underestimated and marginalized in relation to how important it actually is. Do we have, is that included in these 5 disciplines? And do we have the methods to start all the way for such processes?
Hans, that's a beautiful entree into, it's not that it's included in the 5 disciplines, it's that the 5 disciplines can be used in order to make the kinds of collaborations possible. And if you send me your email, I'll send you some links. The very first big activity at SoL, which was a formation of something called the Sustainability Consortium, was a group of very large companies. I'm not sure there was any government, but it was NGOs and big companies for something called the Sustainable Food Lab. And that has been a cross-sector project that's been going on for probably 30 years very successfully. So there's a lot of work in this area.
Carol, just on that score, I did put Telfa's email address in the chat box. If anybody wants the slides, I saw Lindsay asked, and Lindsay, I see you have your hand up. So if anybody wants the links, pop a note to Telfa. Carol, you can send them to Telfa and he can manage that for you If anybody wants the links, he'll send it to them when they write to him. Lindsay,
You
what
have
about?
it.
Sorry?
I believe you have the slides that you're showing.
Yes, but you mentioned some links that you were going to send.
Okay, sure.
I'm saying if anybody wants those links, then Telfa will manage sending them on for you. Lindsay. You're on mute, Linz.
Sorry, thank you very much, Rose and Carol, for a delightful session today. I thought it just appropriate to tell you my story, if I may, around the work that you've done, Carol, and in context with the whole Mandela situation and the South African situation. My late colleague, Brian Wegley, worked very closely with Peter in the mid-90s. And where we actually used what you've been talking about today with great success was in the times prior to the elections of 1994, where we used what you've been talking about today in the Alex Peace process. And so to answer Hans as well, I can honestly say that this really works, in that you can align and bring people together around a common cause with these 5 disciplines. And so I'm always so proud of my organization and the work that Brian Wegley and his team did under the Peace Secretariat at the time to bring peace to Alex prior to the elections of '94. And so the diversity of how this can be applied, I've actually experienced myself. So thank you for that opportunity to just kind of share that, particularly at a time like this in our history.
And then Lynn's on that, Adam Kahane's wonderful book, Solving Tough Problems, talks about managing the transition in South Africa, which Hans, you might want to take a look at that book. It's pretty amazing. It's really deals with scenario planning, but really about how systems thinking contributed to a smooth transition in South Africa. Thanks for bringing that up, Linz.
Thank you, Rose, for the opportunity.
Dave, you have a hand up.
Yeah, on a similar note, and Trevor Barnes asked earlier for a practical example. And I don't know if any of you guys have seen the movie Oslo on Netflix. It's about the Oslo Accords, where the Palestinians and the Israelis got together in a castle in Norway and found one another. And if you think about it, looking at the model now, the movie effectively follows that of self-discovery, of self-mastery, breaking mental models, creating a common vision, etc. And that also, in terms of the South African scenario, so I'd certainly commend the movie as an example of how that way of thinking helps. And I'm also minded of the integration of the creation of the National Defence Force in South Africa out of 16 different formerly combatant units fighting one another. And the same process was followed. It all started, and there may be in that book, it's certainly in another book, where when they got the different forces together, they all came and put their positions. And then somebody effectively went and locked the door and said, okay, tore up his piece of paper and said, okay, this is what I've been told and I'm allowed to say. What are you being told? And when they started sharing what they've been told, they all came to the realization that actually they need to solve this without any of that other stuff. And it went down to the creation of personal trust, as we've discussed before. And there were the most amazing stories of friendships of deep trust developing between people who were 5 years before shooting at one another and wanting to kill one another. And a lot of that really had to start with that left-hand side, starting with the individual before moving into then collectively, where do we need to go and then how are we going to get there? So I think there are, so now knowing the framework, you can see in so many different situations that move from let's get that personal understanding going before we get to where we're going together, and then how do we bring it all together. The philosophy is really very practical in so many different spheres.
And the answer about practical is there's a plethora of documentation about it. But if you look at the Fifth Discipline Field Book, which came because people were asking for examples, there are examples in almost every industry, etc. And that was done in the 90s. So it was a response to people saying the fifth discipline was too theoretical, let me have applied. And so it's multiple authors giving examples where they've actually used it. Annika has it to show you.
Right. But there's no coincidence that this thinking,
go ahead.
I think there's no coincidence that this thinking developed in the 90s, because the old world really came to an end in South Africa and globally with the fall of the Iron Curtain and all the change of the social change which happened there. We needed new models to make sense of what the hierarchical models no longer worked, no longer applicable to the environment.
Right. Annika, can I put you on the spot? Okay. Can you reach over and do the same with the fifth discipline, or is the field book your go-to book?
Annika's on mute anyway.
There, now I'm on. I would say that the fifth discipline book was the one that was most helpful for me when I tried to understand how to work with this. But then I think I really came into the understanding of it all with the book Presence, which is a later book. So the book Presence actually helped me to get the pieces together, even more than the fifth discipline book did.
So that's another topic for a long conversation, because the Presence book is really deeply into the personal part of it, which is extremely important. And that's where Otto began to be involved. But my question, Annika, this is in some ways maybe a good place to end, is can you reach on your shelf and get the fifth discipline the same way you did with the field book?
Well, I have it, but I don't think it's on
point well taken. You don't have to do any more. That's my point. But Luca can get it.
I have a lot of books.
Luca has one for you.
Available.
And Annika found the dance of change.
And Luca's got the
So
book.
if somebody is looking for examples, bottom line is there are many, 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 many.
No, actually not, because the other one I find is this one, which is more recently.
And that's about sustainability.
So actually, what your point is, how important is the book? Obviously, that one is not the one where my starting point is. Actually, I started with the field book and went from there.
My point. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. Carol, a big thank you to you. Annika, for your inputs. Everybody else for their inputs. It was wonderful. I think we had a wonderful conversation. I am looking very forward to our next session, which I'm not sure who's going to be presenting, Heidi or Marilyn or one of the crew. We have a meeting tomorrow to plan who's doing the next one. But I think that a great introduction, Carolyn, a wonderful foundation for the rest of our conversations, and to say to everybody that this is just the beginning. We will be continuing right through next year and thereafter, and have hopefully covered every aspect of organizational learning and systems thinking and other disciplines such as Theory U, and that hopefully anybody who has something to contribute will step forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Annika, you wanted to say something, or was your hand?
I wanted shortly to say that this initiative of you and Stefano is was the starting point of a conversation in SoL Sweden board, when we saw that maybe we could do in parallel SoL Sweden conversations and share it with you, and also maybe run something like this because it's been asked for. So I think this is a good way also to cross communicate over the borders between the different SoL organizations. Thank you.
Annika, we need to pick up that conversation. I saw your email. We will pick it up. Kate, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask one thing. I was really, really enjoying it, and then I had to take a phone call in the middle and missed a bit. That recording that you do, is it available anywhere?
Yes, actually we upload them onto YouTube, but you do need a link. It's a private channel, so it's not for the public. I'm not sure why, but we kind of want to just protect the people on the call and our speakers. We don't have permission to go public. But again, Telfer, if you just pop Telfer an email, he'll send you the link to the YouTube video site.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. We will see you next time. I do want to say that anybody who would like to join our fireside chats, which is a slightly separate event schedule, please also pop Telfer a note, because we are not going to invite people on this call to those just because we want to protect privacy and not spam people. So if you're interested in those, just pop Telfer a note and he'll put you onto our other mailing list as well. So good night, everybody. Have a jolly good time. And everybody in South Africa, please stay safe and stay warm.
Come back home, Roz.
Thank you, Roz. You are the queen of coordination.